What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to 8 Cubes. I'm Cam Best. He's Lamby Series. We're going to start out our day today talking about Scarlet Spider, a 4/5 with the ability to activate and get a clone of himself at a different location. Baseline, this card is a 4/10. I'm seeing a lot of general excitement around this card, but I don't see enough specifics to get myself really excited, and I'll tell you why. This card wants to be a mid-range good cards curve-out deck, and we are currently in the midst of a metagame that we'll detail in a little bit, but is very much predicated on high ceilings. This is a metagame that is all about getting a very high ceiling. If you don't have a high ceiling or some meaningful interactive tools, you're not beating Hela, you're not beating the move decks, you're definitely not beating Clog with a card that takes up 2 board slots. So while this card strikes me as the kind of card where it's like, if it comes out and everyone is playing it, it can change the meta just because everyone is playing it. But I find it hard to come up with a deck that is playing a fair 4/10 and is competing with what Hela is doing. What do you think about that, Lamby?
Yeah, I find it very hard to talk about this card like in its entirety without also like talking about the entire meta right now, right? But we'll get into that like later in the
Mhm.
video as well. But like you mentioned, I was actually quite high on this card because as you said, like by default sort of a 410. But 410 is not enough anymore. Like we I guess some of you already probably know that 410 is not enough anymore, right? Because with the way the meta is right now, 410 actually feels so fair, despite 410 on 2 bodies as well. And like I also personally cannot really see where I want to play this card outside of like generic stats shell. And
Right.
fun fact, generic stats is fair. It's generic
Yeah.
stats doesn't get there anymore, you know. I also think that like the whole activate mechanic being like we'll also talk about this later in the video, which is quite interesting. Like the whole activate mechanic being like stuff that just sits there waiting to be clicked opens up like a lot of counterplay as well.
And I think one thing that I really wanted to specifically call out with Scarlet Spider deck building is a lot of people are going to be talking about things like Namora with this card. I
Mhm.
think that's fundamentally a non-starter. I'm not saying it's not going to be like a strong thing to do if you can do it, but two things happen. First, I don't think you know the lane that the Scarlet Spider clone goes into, which means you
Mhm.
might just be playing your Namora in the incorrect spot.
Yeah.
Second, I don't want to play Namora at all when Clog is as strong as it is right now. I don't want to play a 5/6 that gets blown out by debris and puts more stuff on the board for them to Green Goblin Titania me. I'm not interested in doing that right now. And so when I look at this card, it's like, it's gonna need to be something outside of what you'd call the big three that are happening right now. Hela and Move and Clog. And I'm interested to see what that could be. I think there are some compelling things that this card could do. It's obviously strong on rate. It's obviously the kind of card that, like, if you don't pick it up, you might be like, oh man, I really regret not picking up Scarlet Spider. Because one thing that happens with cards in Marvel Snap is they get sort of locked in at their release level in terms of how people understand them, right? It's a sort of price anchoring thing that happens. Nico Minoru was anchored high because she released in a metagame that was very good for her. And so Nico Minoru is a card that consistently is rated a little bit higher than her actual power level is because everyone is so used to her priors being as good as they are. And this is a card that I think might have the opposite effect, where it's like it's going to release in a meta where it's bad, and it's going to take people a while to get to the part where it's actually amazing. But I just find it hard to believe that over a long enough period of time, a card like this doesn't find a home. It just seems like the numbers on it are too good.
Yeah, I do just want to add that, like as we mentioned, like so it's 4/5 on 2 separate bodies. This card probably just needs one of those like maybe in the future, because now we have stuff like I would say like maybe Forge, we have like Hulkbuster, we have like good fusion style cards that
Right.
like benefit from being duplicated. So maybe in the future there'll be something that like really benefits you splitting a combination effect into like 2 different things, you know, that kind of thing. So I feel maybe in the future there might be something like that as well.
In addition, like maybe that's just the way we have to play Scarlet Spider in a metagame like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like instead of being I'm gonna play fair Scarlet Spider, maybe you're just supposed to combo it. Maybe you're just
Yeah, you
supposed
might
to
have to
go
play
like,
unfair Scarlet
yeah,
Spider, right?
like maybe you're just supposed to be like, I'm gonna make some really big numbers, and maybe they won't be hella level, but I'm not putting in as much effort as they are, and so I'm putting like combo number Scarlet Spider into my deck. And that might be like normally I'd be like, no, you want to do the small package here, but honestly, with the metagame the way that it is, small package deck building, unless it's fusing two things that are already really good in this metagame, is not the way to go. You want to like actually invest. You want to get that big reward.
Yeah, I mean, like one way to not really care about where your second Scarlet Spider clone goes is that if both are just too big
Yep.
for it to really matter, right? Like if it's so big that like you can solo two locations with the split, then yeah, I guess that's one reason. That's one way to not really care where the clone goes.
Yeah. And so, like, with the Nomura stuff, it's like your ordering on that is almost always going to be play Scarlet Spider, play Nomura, activate Scarlet Spider, which is weak to Clog, but it is a 10 power guy, and maybe you're just like, screw it. Maybe that's just what you need to do, right? Like, what if what we're supposed to do is Zabu into Shuri, into Scarlet Spider, into Nomura? What if that's like, what if we're actually just supposed to play for like 15 power dudes? I don't know. Like, the other issue is when you do that, you make yourself a little bit vulnerable to the people that are playing to beat the move decks, right? Decks with Shadow King, decks with Shang-Chi. And it's like, I don't know if it's worth doing that, but I am really interested in seeing how this card lands. Next up, Arana Week in Review. Where have you landed after a week with Arana, Lamby?
Well, the funny thing is I've landed on like I've been playing like more not Arana stuff, right? So I've been doing like okay, so I started the play with like some Agatha stuff. Then I realized that there's no reason to actually do Agatha anymore because Hela's just the bigger boss autopilot style deck. Not really autopilot, but like simple to play deck, because of the Hell Cow and everything like that. So yeah, I've been doing less Arana and more of like Agatha and then into Hela, which is like kind of a powerhouse of a deck right now. What do you think, KM?
So, Arana is hard for me to read. There is definitely a thing that is happening right now where I feel like the Arana package, Arana, Ghost Spider, Madam Web, Vulture, Dagger, maybe one other mover, is the kind of thing you can splash into decks the same way, say, Thena, Angela, Kitty Pride, Hope Summers. That is also splashable in that same way. And it is a little bit more finicky. There's a little bit lower of a floor and a little bit higher of a ceiling when you splash that in there. But you are getting roughly similar output, if not higher output, in the move splash. The issue is just how low the floor is. But honestly, what I'm trying to figure out is how much of that is people want to play with the new cards and people enjoy having Madam Web in their decks, and how much of that is this is actually meaningfully better than the Athena stuff. Because it's hard for me to tell. It feels like it is of a kind with the Athena stuff, but the question is which one is better. I played 2 decks yesterday. One was a Clog Splash in the Athena package, and the other was a Move Splash in the War Machine package. And I felt like the Clog Splash was more consistent. The Athena Splash was more consistent, but the ceiling on the move stuff was actually higher, right? And I guess my real review of Arana is you're not going to really be able to do that splash without her. So in a world where that splash is a relevant thing to be doing, you're probably going to regret not picking her up. And the only question is, how long will we be in the world where that splash is a relevant thing to be doing? And that is what will determine whether or not you think you should get Arana or not. If you don't have Madam Web, I feel like she's almost certainly not worth picking up, because Madam Web is also a key part of that splash, and you will not be able to do that without her. So if you're missing Madam Web, I think you probably also want to miss on Arana. If you have Madam Web, you have to start thinking about, is it worth, what decks can I splash this in? Am I willing to make the sacrifices needed to make that hybridization possible? My instinct is honestly that it's quite strong, but it's also extremely hard to play. And so I would expect it to be like one of those decks where, like, if it does stick around, it's going to be like a lot of top players saying, why do they keep letting this happen? And then you look at the actual win rates of something and it's going to be like 49%. And everyone's going to be like, what are you talking about? It's definitely like a really hard splash to play. And so I think you should consider that as well when you consider purchasing Arana.
Yeah, I think just want to add one thing, which is I feel like Arana plus Madam Web move pulse are definitely something of like a higher skill tier, right? Like it's I feel like when we talk about higher skill tier, in Marvel Snap in general. It's about when there is a lot of player agency, you know, when there's like
Yes.
more than one or two things to do with a particular card. And clearly with Arana and Madam Web, there's like easily 5 things you can do with like the card at like any given one point in time, you know, like in terms of moving to which location or like buffing whatever card, moving the timing of your move and stuff like that as well. So I feel like these cards definitely will have a lower like overall win rate than like what we had last week, right? Like just the Agatha deck that plays itself, you know, that one would have a very easy and high generic win rate because it's doable by everyone and anyone. But with the move Madam Web Arana stuff, it feels like you gotta be really a bit more invested in the game to really understand how to win with these cards.
Let's talk about the three pillars of the metagame in terms of their effects on what it is that they allow you to play, and then talk about each of them in a little bit more detail. Now, the three pillars of the metagame to me are Hela, Move, and Clog. Hela, of course, is a massive point output deck. Move takes many forms. We'll start with probably a generic one with like the Heimdall and the Eliath and the Cosmo, which is basically a points deck that is confusing on turn 6 and has Cosmo and Eliath in order to deal with Hela decks, and really whatever it is people are trying to do to interact with them, whether that be Shang-Chi, Shadow King, or whatever else. And of course, Clog, which is, to my mind, honestly, the one that has felt the strongest of these to me, where it's just like, I don't care what either of you are doing. It's turn 4, I'm playing Titania Green Goblin, you lose. And I feel like these are the 3 decks that you should be prepared for. Not necessarily the literal decks, but the archetypes. You should be prepared for decks interacting in this way, where Hela is the big points combo deck. And, you know, that also applies to something like Phoenix Force. The ways in which you'd be prepared for Hela are similar to the ways you'd be prepared for Phoenix Force by saying, I'm going to clog you up, or I'm going to go over the top of you. The ways in which you'd be prepared for Clog are all going to be kind of the same, whether they're playing the Move Clog deck or the Athena Clog deck. The ways in which you prepared for Move are going to be fairly similar, but again, it's going to depend on what they're trying to do. Move right now is in what I would describe almost as the Wiccan spot, where it's like this mid-range points deck with an Eliath type endgame, where their goal is just make big guys early, Eliath or Heimdall on 6. It's very hard to interact with it because you don't know which one they're going to do. They have this Madam Web Cosmo thing, which is very, very powerful. Just a lot of interesting things going on in the metagame right now, but those are the 3 sort of decks that are sort of setting the lines in which you can exist. You need to be prepared for all of these when they happen.
Yeah, not gonna add too much to this one since we have specific topics of like the 3 decks going forward in this video. But I just want to say that like just want to quick mention Clog versus the other 2. I feel like Clog is because if you look at Move and Hela, right, they're kind of just like do your own thing decks, right? They
Yes.
just like do your own things, build your own boards, get your big stats. Clog is the only one that really says like my game plan is actually to interact with you more than to just like do my own thing, you know. So I feel like Clog would be the one like you mentioned, right? Like you also think that Clog would be the one of the most noteworthy ones per se. I also think so, simply because like Clog has the ability to make your opponent unable to play, you know,
Yeah.
whereas Hela and Move kind of just do their own thing. It's quite a drastic difference.
It's different ways of invalidating your game plan, right?
Yes.
Hela is going to try to invalidate your game plan by just having bigger numbers than you, right? It doesn't matter
Yes.
if you can play if nothing you do measures up, right? Move
Yes.
invalidates your game plan by having bigger numbers and also Cosmo and Eliath. So it's like a slightly more interactive version of that. And then Clog invalidates your game plan by saying, actually, you don't get to play cards. And
Exactly.
I think a lot of people look at this and say, like, why is everything invalidating my game plan, right? But that's kind of what winning means in a card
Yes.
game, is you make your opponent's attempt to win invalid. That's what that means. And like, to some degree, I'm sympathetic to like, what if there were other ways to win? What if like things were closer in point output? But generally speaking, when you try to win, that means you're invalidating your opponent's game plan. That's how winning works. So, I mean, let's talk about the big green mommy at the top of the metagame. Hela is pretty scary, but honestly, I think is starting to sort of balance itself out as people find reasonable ways of combating it. But I don't really expect that to not necessarily keep it down, because Hela is fundamentally a very easy deck to play and a very powerful deck to play. It might not be the best, most optimal choice at the top, highest levels of the metagame, but it's always going to be around because it's easy and strong and the snaps are obvious and you just do good stuff. And so you end up with a deck that just has massive point output after the Hellcow buff and very consistent point output after the Hellcow buff. And even if it has sort of a target on its back, which it definitely does, it is still a deck you can play and succeed with, and it's not a deck that you have to like break your brain over the way that a move deck is, or really try to make sure you have good reads on your opponent the way that a Clog deck can be. And that kind of utility, just good output, low investment, is something that I think is generally good for card games to have. I just wish it wasn't in the form of Hela.
Yeah. I mean, like I think starting with this with this deck out of the tree is like the perfect example to talk
Yeah.
about like decks with like a lower skill ceiling but also like high output, right? Which generally like brings about a point whereby like it's gonna be very popular, you know, because like you can win with it, but you don't need to put a lot of effort to win with it, you know. So like it's just a lot of points, and we mentioned in the previous topic as well, like this deck doesn't really care what your opponent does. For the most part, it just cares whether you draw your own like combo. You know, it's very non-interactive in a sense whereby you really just do your thing versus every deck, and then if your points are somehow not enough, you retreat. But usually it's gonna be definitely enough or over the top, you know. So I feel like Hela will probably be the most popular one, like in the general scheme of things out of all these three decks, simply because of like her ease of play and like her, once again gonna use the deterministic word again, but like it's very obvious when you snap with the deck, very obvious when you probably win with the deck, you know. So I feel like this is one of those decks that will just be around because it's not difficult to play.
I think there's two things to talk about with Hela in terms of why it's so disliked. And the first is that her ceiling is so high, and it's not like it's even like that much higher than other decks that have been in this role before as the like biggest points deck. You look at like bounce decks and things like that. It's not like it's that much higher, but it is actually higher. Like once like it is like a meaningful improvement in the I am the biggest points deck, be taller than me if you want to win, right? Like you look at Agatha, that was the biggest points deck. Now this is the biggest points deck. It is bigger. And so like there has been a meaningful progression in terms of like a deck that is just, I am big numbers and that is all that I am. Hela's numbers are as big as we've ever had from a deck that is this hard to interact with. And the other thing, and this one I think is less important because honestly, I'm not a big fan of gatekeeping decks or gatekeeping ranks based on like pure skill or whatever. I think it's fine that there are easier decks and harder decks, but I think a lot of players who are really good get mad when they don't lose to an opponent or when they lose to an opponent who is not demonstrating they deserve to beat them, right?
Agreed.
And deserve is like a very, I would say, toxic way to think about things. You don't deserve anything, deserve's not real. But I think a lot of people think about things in those terms anyway, where they'd be very okay with this point output if their opponent was working for it. If they were playing like, you know, US Agent Bounce or whatever, they'd be like, okay, they really put the work in here. I get it. I think a lot of players are not okay with Hela having this point output, but would be more okay with a deck that put a lot of work into its sequencing having this point output. And I think that's wrong personally, but I get it.
Yeah, no, I actually think it's like definitely wrong because I've experienced this playing like many different card games as well, right? Like Hela is the quote unquote like anyone can beat you if they draw the nuts deck, right? Like and it's not really wrong, right? Anyone can beat you if they just draw like the perfect Hela curve and everything like that. So I feel like the sentiment of losing to anyone just cause they played a specific deck feels a bit sad sometimes. Like you don't like the feeling, but I don't think it's like I don't think you can actually blame anyone for doing that, right? Like the deck literally exists to do that. The deck exists to be easy to play. So like the fact that it exists, you don't blame the player. You want to blame, you can blame the deck for existing, but you can't blame the player.
I don't even think you can do that. I think it's probably objectively a good thing that a deck like that exists. Like,
yeah, some decks need to exist like that. Yeah.
Like, and the other thing is like I think the issue with Hela is like very simply her numbers are a little too high and there's not really good ways to interact with her. I think that like no one feels this way about Zoo, another easy deck to like another deck that is just like very easy to play. Like just it's just numbers, it's easy to play. No one complains this way about Zoo because if you wanted to beat Zoo, you could build to beat Zoo. But when it comes to like beating Hela, there's not like a tech card you could put in your deck. You have to just be like, all right, I'm gonna go play a whole deck warped around beating Hela. You don't get to actually like play the game you want to play. Hela is dictating terms to you as a piece of the metagame rather than the alternative. And Zoo, for example, is never dictating terms the same way. I'll just put a Killmonger in or whatever, right? Like, it's never dictating terms in the same way Hela can, because it has a slightly lower ceiling and a slightly greater ability to be interacted with.
I also think just one final point, which I also think that this is more of like a psychological thing, like psychological thing as well. Because like I feel like with like because you mentioned Zoo, right? So with Zoo, you can see the build up of the game. You can see like turn one they can play this, turn two they play that. You can see like if you are gradually gonna lose or you're gradually gonna win. Whereas for the Hela is way more feels bad because like they can be doing like practically not much, but then you know that the moment they play the Hela, it's like plus 40 stats everywhere, and then you're just like, oh man, if you're losing to this feels bad, man. It's like I worked so hard. I worked so hard for the last 5 turns, and then like nothing really matters as long as they play Hela. You know, the sentiment just feels worse when you lose to Hela. I kind of get it as well, but yeah, doesn't mean that you should like fault Hela players for being Hela players. You know, it's just the way the deck is.
Let's move on to Move, which is a very strong deck that I almost felt bad putting up here as like an archetype unto itself, when so much of what Move is like hybridizing 6 move cards into some other stuff. Like, the pure Move deck is basically exactly what you think it looks like, except with Alioth and Cosmo in it. It's like all the move cards you would expect to have in there, and then Alioth Cosmo, and then like they get less pure from there until you get like I have the deck that I like playing, the Drink, which is splashing it in a Cannonball Clog. You get to I was splashing it instead of in Cannonball Clog in the Storm War Machine thing. It's just a strong package to have access to right now. But what Move is able to do is meaningfully compete when it high rolls with Hela, which changes the snap dynamics of that matchup dramatically, and then also just introduce a lot of high roll points into the meta. But what I really wanted to talk about with Move is that I feel like the more decks are splashing this in, the more it's about like, I drew my stuff the right way. I got this and you didn't, and that means you are getting run over, because I got Arana Madam Web. You didn't get Arana Madam Web. You're sitting there playing a Vulture on turn 3. That sucks, man, because the package is so two halves. It's so, if you have the right stuff in the right order, it's as strong as anything, but you have these like brick draws where your deck just doesn't actually have cards in it anymore. And I think that like that is kind of fascinating, and it's the kind of thing that is forced on a metagame by a deck like Hela dictating terms, because you have to abandon your consistent point packages and go towards something that is less consistent with a higher ceiling in order to compete.
Yeah, I want to add two things to what you mentioned, which is also really quite interesting to think about, right? Like, firstly, because of Hela as well in the meta, right, you have to run things like Cosmo, Alioth, and in a so-called like clockwork deck where you need to draw cards in the right order, where you need to draw combinations of cards. Running stuff that don't actually synergize. Don't get me wrong, Cosmo and Alioth are good with priority, yes. But like they don't actually make your move stuff better. In fact, they actually make your move stuff worse because they don't actually contribute to like the move strategy at all. It's actually just like you're playing these tech cards because Hela exists, you know. But then that leads me to the second point, which is that this is totally the opposite thing of move bounce, right? Because what move bounce used to be was that you wanted to dodge prior and like play your powerful stuff, and then like so they cannot counter you. But now you are playing like floodgate cards, right? Like Cosmo, Alioth, which means you kind of want the prior. So it's like it's literally like the opposite of what move bounce was. And I guess this is like because of the way the meta is right now, right? Like in order to combat Hela, you kind of want prior as well.
It's also because they nerfed Taskmaster.
Yeah, of course. You can't go for straight up pure points anymore, right? You need like some like disruption and like floodgates to combat like other stuff.
Right, and I think that if Taskmaster didn't exist, if we had 5 energy Taskmaster in this metagame,
we'd be playing the old build with absurd points, right?
It would not be fun. Like it would not be a fun time. I guess I would say Hela probably wouldn't exist because it has like a 0% matchup into like a 40 power Human Torch. Like you just don't beat that. But
no interaction whatsoever.
Yeah, like but at the same time, we talk about like Hela wouldn't exist. The reason it wouldn't exist is because that deck with Taskmaster in it would just be in the role of bigger Hela. It would be doing the same thing but bigger, and we'd all hate it. And so, honestly, I think they did the right thing on Taskmaster, because like that is exactly what we all hate it when Hela does it. I don't know why we wouldn't hate it when Human Torch Taskmaster does it. I think I would hate it even more because the numbers would be even more unapproachably large.
Yeah, the Taskmaster nerf was such future sight, right? Like if
Mm-hmm.
you think about it, it's not really just it wasn't actually just that, like it literally like nerfed and changed what a potential metagame could be, you know. Like
Yeah.
the potential metagame would be like big boy move deck and zero Hela, right? Because like you mentioned, like the move stuff, if they had the old Taskmaster, was just like definitely more points than the
Yes.
Hela as well. Oh, I wanna cycle back to one point that you mentioned earlier, which is like the move deck like has to draw like cards in the right order. So like if you play a mirror and then like someone draws Arana, Madam Web, and you don't, you just feel like you lost, right? I feel like this is only super duper extremely relevant in the mirror, right? Because I feel like if you are playing versus not the mirror, you have a small leeway to maybe not draw so perfect. Because like if you think about it, right, if your opponent is going Arana, Madam Web, and like move stuff, you always lose out on like overall points. But then if you're playing against like not the mirror, you kind of have like a little bit of leeway to draw your stuff a little bit less like on curve, right? Because like at the end of the day, your opponent is not outputting that kind of like exact amount of points as you if they drew the nuts. So
Last of the three pillars, but certainly not least, is
mhm.
Clog, which is just a classically powerful deck. When the metagame gets like this, Clog is sort of what brings it back into line a lot of the time. This is a deck that every time Hela is good, this comes up to beat it, basically. And whether that be the last time Hela is good, what it led to was Professor X Cannonball, right? Like this time, we don't have Professor X, but we do have Titania, who, by the way, I am just increasingly coming to believe is just unbelievably strong. Like I've
Mhm.
had games where it's like I don't play anything on turn 1. I don't play anything on turn 2. They play one card. I play a debris in the lane that card isn't in. Okay, it is now turn 4. They have two things in that lane. Titania Green Goblin. I win that lane. The game
Done.
is over. Like it's just done. It's just like, "Oh my god, that's not okay." Like there's just a lot of really strong Clog cards in the game right now, and the two I would point at the most are probably White Widow and Kate Bishop. And Titania has
Mm.
existed for a while, but they sort of scale with each other, right? Titania Goblin has been around without being problematic, but you have so many other things that go with it now. So you have all these combinations of turn 4 or 5, two clogs, game ends, right? So you have like, okay, it's turn 4. I got an acid arrow. I have acid arrow White Widow. I have acid arrow Green Goblin. I have Titania Acid Arrow. I have all of this crap. Like, there's just so many different combinations of Clog cards that at least one of them costs less than 3. And that power means that, like, you're almost always able to access something like this turn 4 Clog strategy. It doesn't have to be on turn 4. And I think one of
Yep.
the biggest mistakes people make with Clog is they play this stuff out before they can combo it. They like play a
Yeah.
White Widow on curve or whatever. And it's like, no, don't do that. Do that when it matters. Save that for when it matters. Save that for the time when it's filling up a lane. Because Clog doesn't matter until they can't play there anymore. And then it really matters.
Yeah. So for Clog, it's quite interesting whereby like I feel like it's you kind of need a bit of tempo, but at the same time you don't need too much tempo. And what KM mentioned really hit the nail on the head, which is like clock card effects, they compound severely when you know that by playing the card your opponent can no longer play there, you know.
Yes.
So like I feel like there is a lot of the times whereby firstly the cards are usually really cheap, right? Like Acid Arrow, Titania, White Widow, it's all like super low cost stuff anyway. Like yes, you play them out on curve sometimes, they just you just spend your mana, it kind of works. But the compounding effect of not letting your opponent play and knowing when you cannot let your opponent play gives you a bit more like agency to hold some of these cards sometimes as well. So it's really quite interesting. Like this is one of those field decks that like sometimes you're very incentivized to just not spend all your mana.
Yeah.
Because spending your mana when you know your opponent can't play there after this turn is actually more important, you know. But I also want to do like one like unofficial SD customer survey thing, which is like if you were to lose to Clog or lose to Hela, which do you feel like more bad about losing to? Because my answer might be very different from most people. I don't know what you think. Do you feel worse losing to Clog or worse losing to Hela?
Our last two topics are just shouting out cards that have been great for us recently. Just want to shout out Red Guardian. Let's just start with
Love
like
this
that.
card.
Well, just a great card, right? The minute more activates got released, Red Guardian became a much more appealing proposition. And right now, like I feel like if I'm making a deck that is trying to quote unquote counter the metagame, I'm playing Red Guardian. Like I
Mm,
just want that card in there because okay, I'm playing against a Clog deck. How are they getting their points? It's Thena or it's Madam Web, right? That's how they're getting their points. I'm going to Red Guardian that. I'm playing against a pure move deck. I'm going to Red Guardian that Madam Web. I don't want that to exist. I'm going to Red Guardian that Arana with priority, and they're going to have their stuff in the wrong spot. I'm going to do all of that. I'm playing against the Hela deck. Okay, I'm going to Red Guardian that Hell Cow, dude. Like, I'm going to Red Guardian the Hell Cow. It's going to go away. And so it is just like, if you're trying to like build some kind of brew mid-range deck, Red Guardian goes in that deck right now. And it's not going to do it all on its own. He's not a hard carry. He just has a lot of good hits in the metagame right now. He's not going to hard carry you in any of these, but he can help drag the meta decks down to a level where you can handle them with the rest of what you're doing. And that, I think, is just a really valuable tech card to have in your arsenal when you are trying to combat something like this.
I just want to say that I really am interested to talk about this topic because by far, Red Guardian out of every card that's been printed in the game so far is my favorite tech card by far, like of all time. Because I feel like, okay, so one thing I really don't like doing, I don't like not spending my mana, to be honest. I feel like I don't like not playing my cards, you know.
Right.
So Red Guardian is the one tech card that you can play at any given one point in time. Obviously, there are certain points whereby you would want to play it on a specific target, but in many matchups, you can just play the damn card, like on curve or whatever, and it does work, right? There's like never really a time that you hit something completely irrelevant. But okay, to be more specific, I feel Red Guardian's like comeback right now is really just because there's so many, in my terms, I would like to call them floaters, which is basically cards that just sit there waiting to destroy your hopes and dreams, right? They're like Hell Cow, right? It just sits there waiting for the perfect time. Madam Web sits there waiting for, well, whatever they want to move and
pretty much
like
anything, yeah.
Pretty much anything, right? Like there's so many cards in the game that like it's very different from how it used to be, right? It used to be like, oh, I want to Shang-Chi one specific target. Now it's like everything on your opponent's board is just waiting for something to like trigger like a chain reaction, and Red Guardian with priority stops the chain reaction. You know, this is basically saying that Red Guardian is kind of just good versus activate mechanic, because as long as you have priority, right, you can kind of just like know when they are gonna like start doing some crazy thing, and then you just Red Guardian the activator, and then you stop the whole combo from happening to begin with, right? Like instead of being reactive with something like Shang-Chi killing the big thing, Red Guardian solves the problem whereby if you have priority, it kind of just lets you stop the whole reaction from happening, you know. So I feel like Red Guardian is in that spot right now whereby because of the more because of more activate cards being like played in the game right now, Red Guardian has like way more like significant targets, and I think that's why he could potentially be like a sort of mini meta breaker of sorts if you were to play like a counter strategy right now.
Finally, we talked when the War Machine combo first released about how it probably wasn't the right time right now when everyone was doing it. But I actually had a pretty good time playing just War Machine plus Madam Web package yesterday, where it was just like, we have our Storm combo win, which is how we can beat Hela or whatever. Really how we can beat anything, right? And we also have this points package that in games where that isn't happening can carry it. It was a little bit of an awkward fusion. Like, it definitely suffered from, like, you know how in, like, Hearthstone, sometimes you'll have a ramp deck and you'll draw all ramp or all big guys, and it's just like, oh, okay, I guess I'm not doing anything this game. It had some of that. It had what I like to call ramp deck syndrome sometimes. But the power was there, and it felt pretty rudimentary to me, honestly, where it was just like, this is not a finished product, and I think there's maybe something here. I think it might be time for people to start reinvestigating the War Machine Legion stuff. If they can figure out a way to get it into their decks in a way that synergizes and isn't just like, I'm going to play all the cards that are good with War Machine, I think it could be a good spot. There's not a lot of other War Machines running around anymore. Everyone's sort of moved away from that, which means you're not just like rando losing to that stuff anymore. I kind of think it might be worth people taking a look there.
Yeah, this topic just also further like cements the fact that Red Guardian is relevant again, right? Because War Machine is once again a very perfect target for Red Guardian. No, but yeah, I do agree. I do agree that War Machine like Legion or just like War Machine Splash a little here and there has like a lot more potential than we are actually seeing it for, right? Like I feel like once we move past the meme of the War Machine Storm Legion, and like maybe if we explore doing War Machine stuff in more things like you did in the Move Shell, there could be something right there. Like at the end of the day, the card is like it's like a well-stated unit, well-stated card that like has an effect tagged along aside it, right? So I feel like there's actually way more we can explore with the card, and yeah, I'm excited to see what we can do with it.
All right, y'all. That's gonna be all from us today. I have been KM Best. He has been Lamby Series. We are 8 cubes, and we will see you in the next one. Lamby, take us out of here.
Thank you so much for being here with us. Like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you guys on the next video. Bye bye.